The stars burned cold and distant when the warship Crimson Fang tore through the fabric of space and emerged into the darkness of the Riker system. And Alpha Kalash stood at the command deck with his claws digging into the metal railing as his golden eyes scanned the view screen for the first glimpse of his homeworld. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The colony world of Riker Prime hung in the void like a wounded animal, and thick columns of smoke rose from the surface where fires still burned across the northern continent, and the orbital defense stations drifted in pieces, their weapons silent and their crews dead. "No," whispered Kalash, and his voice was barely a growl, and his silver-streaked fur stood on end as the full weight of what he was seeing crashed down upon him. The bridge crew around him had gone completely still, and these were warriors who had faced death 1,000 times. But now they stood frozen as they watched their home burn. Lieutenant Vaughn was the first to speak, and his voice cracked as he read the data streaming across his console. "Alpha, we are receiving emergency transmissions from the surface, and the attack came 3 cycles ago, and the consortium fleet numbered 12 vessels, and they hit the agricultural zones first and then moved to the population centers." Kalash felt his hearts pounding in his chest, both of them beating so hard he thought they might burst through his ribs. And there was only one question that mattered now. "The nursery compound," he said, and his voice was steady even though his soul was screaming. "What is the status of the nursery compound?" The silence that followed was the worst sound Kalash had ever heard. Vern would not meet his eyes, and the young lieutenant stared at his console as if hoping the data would change if he looked at it long enough. "Report," commanded Kalash, and now his voice was the voice of the Alpha, the voice that had led the Vakari pack through 40 years of war, the voice that made enemies tremble and allies stand tall. "The nursery compound was hit directly," said Vaughn, and tears were streaming down his furred face. "The buildings are destroyed, and the Guardians are dead. And we have confirmed that 43 cubs were taken before the consortium fleet retreated." 43 cubs. The number echoed in Kalash's mind like a death bell, and he thought of all those young ones, barely old enough to walk on their own, ripped from their beds and thrown into cages by slavers who saw them as nothing more than cargo. He thought of his daughter Vera, who had just learned to howl her first hunting song, and whose golden eyes were the same shade as her mother's had been before the sickness took her. Vera was among the 43. Kalash threw back his head and howled, and the sound that came from his throat was not the howl of a warrior or the howl of an alpha, but the howl of a father whose child had been stolen. And it was a sound of such pure agony that every Vakari on the ship felt it in their bones one by one. The crew joined him, and the howl spread through the Crimson Fang like wildfire. And soon every warrior on the ship was crying their grief into the void. And the sound carried across frequencies and wavelengths that even the most advanced technology could not block in distant systems. Pirates and slavers and merchants heard that howl through their communication arrays, and they shuddered without knowing why. And some of them who had dealt with the Vakari before immediately changed course and fled for safer space. The howling went on for a long time, and when it finally stopped, something had changed in the hearts of every Vakari on that ship. The grief was still there, burning like a wound that would never heal. But now it had been joined by something else. Something cold and sharp, and ancient vengeance turned to face his crew, and his golden eyes were dry now, and his voice was calm in a way that made even his most seasoned warriors feel a chill run down their spines. "We hunt," he said simply, and those 2 words carried more weight than any speech he had ever given. The bridge exploded into action, and officers ran to their stations, and the engines of the Crimson Fang roared to life with renewed purpose. Kalash walked to the tactical display and studied the data that was streaming in from the surface. And piece by piece, he began to construct the trail that would lead him to his cubs. The consortium fleet left the system heading toward the outer rim, reported his navigation officer. They made at least 3 hyperspace jumps before we lost their signature. Then we follow, said Kellish. We follow until the stars themselves burn out if we must. He turned to address his entire crew, and every eye on the bridge was fixed upon him. The consortium has taken our children, he said, and his voice carried to every corner of the ship through the internal communication system. They have broken the most sacred law that exists among our people, and they have stolen our future. And they believe that they can hide from us in the darkness between stars. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was a terrible promise in his words. They are wrong, and we will find them, and we will find our cubs, and when we do, the galaxy will learn what happens when you take from the pack. The warriors on the bridge slammed their fists against their chests in salute, and the sound echoed like thunder, and the hunt began over the next 7 cycles. The Crimson Fang tore through space like a predator on the scent of blood, and they tracked the consortium fleet from system to system. And at each stop, they found witnesses and debris and terrified spacers who had seen the slaver ships. Pastor Keelash interrogated each witness personally, and he was patient and methodical and utterly relentless. And no detail was too small to investigate. They learned that the consortium was heading toward Terran space, toward the territory of a young species called humans, who had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. The humans are weak, said one of his advisors. They are soft and fragile, and barely capable of defending their own borders. And the consortium likely believes they can hide among them without fear of pursuit. Kalish listened to this assessment and nodded slowly. And he did not care about humans or their weakness or their borders. He cared only about his cubs. Set course for Terran space, he commanded, and the Crimson Fang leaped into hyperspace. And the hunt continued in his private quarters that night. Kalish sat alone in the darkness and held a small holographic image of his daughter Vera, and he watched her smile and laugh and chase her own tail in the recording. And he made a promise to her across the stars. I am coming, he whispered. Hold on, little one, and your father is coming. Elena Vasquez had never considered herself a hero, and she had spent most of her 34 years just trying to survive in a galaxy that did not care much about people like Hirsch. She was a cargo hauler, the captain and only crew member of a beaten-up old ship called the Stubborn Mule. And she made her living carrying goods between the outer colonies, where the big shipping companies did not bother to go. The Stubborn Mule was not a pretty ship, and her hull was patched in a dozen places, and her engines made sounds that would have made any proper engineer weep. But she flew, and that was enough for Elena on the day that changed everything. Elena was running a cargo of medical supplies to a mining colony in the Kepler sector, and she was tired and hungry and looking forward to a hot meal and a real bed when she picked up a distress signal on her long-range scanner. The signal was faint and automated, the kind of beacon that ships sent out when their crews had abandoned them. And Elena almost ignored it because derelict ships were usually more trouble than they were worth. But something made her change course, some feeling in her gut that she could not explain. And she told herself that maybe there would be some good salvage, and that would make the detour worthwhile. What she found was a consortium vessel, a big ugly thing with slave pens built into its cargo holds, drifting dead in space with its engines burned out and its life support failing. No way, Elena muttered to herself as she matched velocity with the derelict and scanned it for life signs. No way am I going into that. But her scanner showed life signs, dozens of them, and they were small and weak and fading fast. Elena sat in her pilot's seat for a long moment and stared at the readout. And she thought about all the reasons she should turn around and fly away. And there were many good reasons, and any sensible person would have listened to them. She was not a fighter, and she had no weapons beyond a rusty old pistol that barely worked, and the consortium was dangerous. And getting involved with their business was a good way to end up dead or worse. But there were children on that ship. She was sure of it now, and they were dying while she sat here thinking about her own safety. "Damn it," she said. And she suited up and grabbed her pistol and crossed over to the derelict ship through the cold vacuum of space. The inside of the consortium vessel was dark and smelled like fear and suffering. And Elena moved through the corridors with her heart pounding in her chest and her flashlight. Cutting through the shadows, she found the crew quarters empty and the bridge abandoned. And the escape pods were gone, and it was clear that the slavers had fled when their engines failed and left their cargo behind to dive. The cargo Elena found them in the lower hold, in cages meant for animals, and what she saw made her stop in the doorway and forget how to breathe. They were children, dozens of them, small and furry with wolf-like faces and big frightened eyes. And they were pressed together in the cages like they were trying to protect each other from the cold. Some of them were wounded, and all of them were starving. And they looked at Elena with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that broke her heart into pieces. "Oh God," she whispered. And she did not know what species they were or where they came from. But none of that mattered because they were children and they were hurting, and she could help. She spent the next hour cutting open cages and carrying the cubs, one by one, back to the stubborn mule. And it was hard work because some of them were too weak to walk and others were too scared to let her touch them, but she talked to them in a soft voice the whole time, even though she knew they could not understand her words. And slowly they began to trust her. The last cub she rescued was a small female with golden eyes and silver-streaked fur. And this one was different from the others because she was not afraid at all. The little one looked up at Elena with a fierce expression and growled something in a language Elena did not understand. And then she grabbed Elena's hand and held on tight and refused to let go. "Okay, little one," said Elena with a tired smile. "I guess you are coming with me too." She counted 43 cubs in total, and she had no idea how she was going to feed them or care for them or get them home. But she was not going to abandon them now. Next 3 weeks were the hardest of Elena's life. Her ship was not designed to carry passengers, and certainly not 43 alien children who did not speak her language and did not know what human food was safe to eat. She learned through trial and error what they could digest. And she ruined half her food supplies before she figured out that they could eat the protein bars if she mixed them with water. And she gave them her own rations when her supplies ran low. She learned their body language too. Learned that bared teeth was a smile and not a threat. Learned that they liked to sleep in piles for warmth and comfort. Learned that they communicated partly through sounds and partly through the positions of their ears and tails. One of the cubs was braver than the others, a young male with dark fur and curious eyes. And he was always the first to approach Elena when she brought food, and the first to explore new parts of the ship. She started calling him Scout because he was always scouting ahead of the group. And he seemed to like the name even though he did not know what it meant. Scout was the first one to sleep next to her instead of with the other cubs. And when he curled up against her side and closed his eyes with complete trust, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. The little female with golden eyes, the fierce one who had grabbed her hand in the slaver ship, stayed close to Elena. Elena called her Vera because the sound seemed to make her happy. And she did not know that she had accidentally given the cub her real name. Vera was protective of Elena in a way that the other cubs were not. And she would growl at any of the others who got too rough during play. And she slept at Elena's feet like a guard dog. The life support on the stubborn mule was not meant to handle 44 people. And Elena spent hours every day making repairs and adjustments. And some nights she went without sleep because the oxygen levels were dropping and she had to fix the scrubbers before anyone suffocated. She lost weight because she was giving most of her food to the cubs. And there were dark circles under her eyes. And her hands were cut and bruised from all the repairs. But she did not stop. She could not stop one night. When the cubs were sleeping in a pile in the cargo hold, and the ship was quiet, Elena sat in her pilot's seat and watched the stars and wondered if anyone was looking for these children. Someone must be, she said to herself. Someone must be missing them. She thought about what she would do when she reached civilization, and she knew she would have to find someone who could help her contact the Cubs people. And she hoped that whoever they were, they would come soon in the cargo hold. Scout woke up and padded over to where Elena was sitting, and he climbed into her lap and looked up at her with his big dark eyes. Elena smiled down at him and stroked his fur gently, and he made a soft sound that she had learned was the sound of happiness. "Do not worry, little one," she said. "I am going to keep you safe, and I am going to find your family, and everything is going to be okay." Scout did not understand her words, but he understood her voice and her touch and her warmth, and he closed his eyes and fell asleep in her arms. Elena held him close and watched the stars and waited for whatever came next. The consortium escape pod tumbled through the darkness of space like a leaf caught in a storm, and inside the cramped vessel, 5 slavers sat in terrified silence as the shadow of the Crimson Fang fell over them. They had been running for 2 weeks, jumping from system to system, hiding in asteroid fields and behind gas giants. But the Vrikari had found them anyway. The Vrikari always found them. Alpha Kelish stood in the boarding tube and watched as his warriors cut through the escape pod's hull with plasma torches, and the metal screamed and glowed red as it melted away. And when the breach was large enough, he stepped through into the vessel. The slavers scrambled backward until they hit the far wall, and they stared at Kalash with wide eyes full of fear. And one of them was crying and begging in a language Kalash did not bother to understand. He was a tall Vrikari, taller than most of his kind, and his silver-streaked fur was bristled with controlled rage, and his golden eyes burned with a cold fire that made the slavers feel like prey animals trapped before a predator. "You know why I am here," said Kalash, and his voice was quiet and calm, and somehow that made it more terrifying than any shout could have been. The slaver who seemed to be in charge, a thin creature with gray skin and too many eyes, tried to speak. "We are just merchants," it said, and its voice was shaking so hard that the words came out broken. "We do not know anything about any cubs." Kalash moved faster than the eye could follow, and suddenly his claws were around the slaver's throat, and he was lifting it off the floor like it weighed nothing at all. "You were on the ship that raided my homeworld," said Kalash, and now there was heat in his voice. Now there was anger. "You were part of the crew that took 43 children from the nursery compound, and you will tell me where they are. And you will tell me now." The slaver's many eyes were bulging, and its thin limbs were kicking uselessly in the air. And it tried to speak, but Kalash's grip was too tight. He loosened his hold just enough to let the creature breathe. And he waited. "The ship," gasped the slaver. "The engine failed, and we had to abandon it. And the cargo was still on board when we left." "The children," growled Kalash. "Say it correctly. They are children, not cargo." "The children," repeated the slaver quickly. The children were still on the ship. Kalash felt his heart clench in his chest, and he thought of Vera alone on a dying ship in the cold emptiness of space. And he had to use every bit of his discipline to keep from crushing the slaver's throat right there. "Where is the ship?" he demanded. The slaver gave him coordinates, babbling them out as fast as it could, and Kalash memorized them instantly. "There is more," said the slaver, and it seemed almost eager now, almost pleased. "A human found the ship, a female on a small cargo vessel, and she was alone. And by now your cubs have probably killed her, or she has sold them, or she has left them to die." The slaver made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That is what everyone does," it said. "That is what we would have done if the engines had not failed. And your cubs would have brought a good price on the black market. And there are collectors who pay well for exotic species. Kalish stared at the slaver for a long moment, and his expression did not change at all. Then he twisted his wrist, and the slaver's neck snapped like a dry branch, and the body fell to the floor of the escape pod with a soft thump. The other slavers screamed and tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. And Kalish's warriors were already moving through the breach in the hull. "Take them to the interrogation cells," commanded Kalish. "Find out everything they know about this human, and find out if there are any other consortium ships in this sector." His warriors obeyed instantly, dragging the crying slavers away. And Kalish stood alone in the escape pod and thought about what he had learned. Human had found his cubs. He knew very little about humans, only that they were a young species who had discovered faster-than-light travel less than a century ago, and that they were considered weak and unimportant by most of the galaxy's major powers. They were soft creatures with no claws and no fangs and no natural weapons. And they were fragile and easy to kill, and most other species did not take them seriously, but one of them had found his cubs. And Kalish did not know what that meant. The slaver had said that the human would kill the cubs or sell them or abandon them, and perhaps that was true, because that was what most species would do when faced with the burden of 43 hungry, frightened children who were not their own. But Kalish had learned long ago not to assume anything, and he would not know the truth until he reached the coordinates and saw for himself. He walked back to the bridge of the Crimson Fang and gave the order to set course for the location the slaver had provided. And the great warship turned toward human space and engaged its engines at maximum speed in his private chambers that night. Kalish was visited by his oldest friend and most trusted advisor, a scarred warrior named Theron, who had fought beside him since they were young cubs themselves. "The crew is restless," said Theron as he sat across from the Alpha. "They want blood, and they are preparing the Vengeance Blades." Kalish nodded slowly. The Vengeance Blades were ancient weapons, used only when cubs had been harmed, and the ritual of blood payment demanded that anyone who had touched a Vakari child with harmful intent must die by those blades. "If the human has hurt our cubs," said Kalish, "then she will face the blades, and I will wield them myself." "And if she has not hurt them?" asked Theron. "What then?" Kalish was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy. "I do not know," he admitted. "No outsider has ever been faced with such a choice, and no outsider has ever chosen anything but their own profit and survival." He looked at the holographic image of Vera that sat on his desk, and his golden eyes were filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I want to believe that my daughter is alive and safe," he said. "But I have seen too much of this galaxy to believe in miracles." Theron reached across and put his paw on Kalish's shoulder. "We will find them," he said. "Whatever has happened, we will find them and we will bring them home." Kalish placed his own paw over his friend's and squeezed gently. "Yes," he said. "We will." The next 3 days were the longest of Kalish's life, and he spent most of them on the bridge, watching the stars streak past and counting the hours until they reached the coordinates. He did not sleep, and he barely ate, and his crew watched him with worried eyes, but knew better than to speak when the Crimson Fang finally dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of human territory. Kalish was standing at the tactical display with his claws extended and his teeth bared. "Scan for the human vessel," he commanded. "Find me that ship." His officers worked quickly and efficiently, and within minutes they had located a small cargo vessel drifting near a debris field about 3 light hours away. "That is the ship," said Lieutenant Vorn. "The registry identifies it as the Stubborn Mule, and it is crewed by a single human female named Elena Vasquez. And the life support is failing." Kalish felt his heart stop for a single terrible moment. "Life signs," he demanded. "How many life signs on that ship?" Vorn checked his readings and then checked them again. And when he looked up at the Alpha, there was wonder in his eyes. 44, he said. I am reading 44 life signs, and 43 of them are Vrakari. The bridge went completely silent. Set course, said Kalish. And his voice was barely a whisper. Maximum speed. The corridor of the stubborn mule was silent, except for the soft sounds of Kalish holding his daughter. And the warriors who had come expecting battle stood frozen in place as they watched their Alpha weep. Elena stayed very still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might break the moment one by one. The other cubs began to creep forward, and they recognized the warriors as their own kind. And they made soft sounds of hope and longing. A warrior with rust-colored fur dropped to his knees as a small cub ran to him. And Elena realized that this must be the cub's father or uncle or guardian. And the sound the warrior made when he gathered the little one into his arms was the sound of a heart being put back together all around her. Reunions were happening. And the fierce warriors who had boarded her ship with murder in their eyes were now crying and laughing and holding their cubs like they would never let go. Elena watched it all with tears streaming down her own face. And she felt a deep, aching joy that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Scout pressed against her leg, and she looked down at him and realized that he was one of the few cubs who had not run to a warrior. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly, and she knelt down to his level. Is there no one here for you? Scout looked up at her with his dark eyes, and he made a sound that she had come to recognize as sadness. And she understood without words that his family had not survived the raid. She pulled him into a hug and held him close. And she whispered into his fur that she was sorry. That she was so sorry. Kalish rose to his feet with Vera still in his arms. And he turned to face Elena. His golden eyes were wet with tears. And his expression was one of complete bewilderment as he looked at this small human woman who had done the impossible. I do not understand, he said. And his voice was rough. The slavers told me that you would kill them or sell them or leave them to die. And that is what anyone would do. Elena stood up slowly, keeping Scout close to her side. I found children in cages, she said simply. I could not leave them. But you are human, said Kalish. And there was no insult in the words, only confusion. You have no claws and no fangs and no natural weapons, and we are not your people. And you had nothing to gain by helping them. Elena thought about that for a moment. And when she answered, her voice was quiet but steady. They were scared and hungry and hurt, she said. They were children who needed help, and I was there. And that was enough. She looked at the cubs who were now safe in the arms of their families. And she smiled. It did not matter that they were not human, she said. It only mattered that they were children. Kalish stared at her for a long time, and the warriors around him watched in silence as their Alpha processed what he was hearing. You starved yourself to feed them, said Kalish. And it was not a question. I can see it in your face. And I can see it in the way your clothes hang loose on your body. Elena shrugged. They needed the food more than I did. You went without sleep to keep your ship running, continued Kalish. I can see the exhaustion in your eyes and the cuts on your hands from repairs. Elena shrugged again. The life support was failing, she said. I had to keep it running. You gave them your blankets and your warmth and your comfort, said Kalish. And now his voice was barely above a whisper. You gave them everything you had. And you asked for nothing in return. Elena did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing. Vera squirmed in her father's arms and reached out toward Elena, making a sound of distress, and Kalish looked at his daughter in surprise. She wants you, he said. And there was wonder in his voice. She is safe in my arms. And still she reaches for you. We have been together for 3 weeks, said Elena. I think she got used to me. Kalish set Vera down. And the little one immediately ran to Elena and grabbed her hand and held on tight. just like she had done on the slaver ship when they first met. Elena looked down at her and smiled, and she stroked the silver-streaked fur on the cub's head. "Hey, little one," she said softly. "Your daddy is here now, and you are safe." Vera made a sound that Elena did not understand, and then she spoke in halting broken common, words that she must have learned by listening to Elena talk over the past weeks. "You stay," said Vera, and her golden eyes were fierce. "You pack," the warriors gasped, and Kalish's eyes went wide, and Elena felt her heart stop in her chest. "What does that mean?" she asked, looking at Kalish. "What does it mean when she says that?" The older warrior with the scarred face stepped forward again, and his voice was hushed with reverence. "To be claimed as pack by a cub is the highest honor our people can bestow," he explained. "It is sacred law, older than our recorded history, and it cannot be undone or ignored." He looked at Elena with new eyes, eyes that held respect instead of suspicion. "If a cub claims someone as pack, that person becomes family," he said. "They are protected by the pack, and they are bound to the pack, and no Vrikari can raise a hand against them." Elena looked down at Vera, and then at Scout, who was still pressed against her side, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes again. "I did not ask for this," she said. "I just wanted them to be safe." Kalish stepped forward until he was standing directly in front of her, and he looked down at this human woman who had given everything she had to save children who were not her own. "That is why you received it," he said. "That is why my daughter chose you." He reached out and placed his paw on her shoulder, and his touch was gentle despite his size and strength. "I came here expecting to find a monster," he said. "I came here with vengeance in my heart and death on my claws, and I was prepared to make you pay for every moment of suffering my cubs endured." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Instead, I found a human woman who starved herself to feed our children, who exhausted herself to keep them warm, who gave them hope when they had none." Kalish looked around at his warriors, at the cubs in their arms, at the tears on their faces. "I do not know how to repay such a debt," he said. "I do not know if such a debt can ever be repaid." Elena shook her head. "I do not want payment," she said. "I just want them to be happy and safe." Kalish smiled, and it was the first time Elena had seen him smile, and it transformed his face from terrifying to almost gentle. "You see," he said, "that is exactly why my daughter is right about you." He looked at the other warriors and raised his voice so that all could hear. "This human is Pack," he announced. "My daughter has spoken, and her word is law. And from this day forward, Elena Vasquez is family." The warriors responded with a howl that made the walls of the stubborn mule vibrate, and it was a sound of welcome and acceptance and joy. Elena stood in the middle of it all, with Vera holding her hand and Scout pressed against her side. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she belonged. Elena was reading a story to the cubs when she saw the warships appear on her scanner, and her heart dropped into her stomach as she counted 1, 2, 5. 10 massive vessels surrounding her tiny ship like wolves circling a wounded deer. She knew immediately what they were. The cubs had been drawing pictures for her over the past few weeks, using scraps of paper and colored markers that Elena had found in her emergency supplies. And many of those pictures showed great ships with sharp angles and fierce designs. Those were the ships of their people. The cubs had tried to explain through gestures and drawings. And those were the ships that would come to take them home, and now those ships were here. And Elena felt a strange mixture of relief and terror flooding through her body. Relief, because the cubs would finally be safe with their own kind, and terror because she had no idea how their people would react to finding a lone human with their stolen children. She had heard stories about the Vrikari during her years of hauling cargo through the outer systems, and none of those stories were gentle. They were warriors, the story said, fierce and loyal and absolutely merciless when it came to protecting their pack. And they had destroyed entire fleets in response to insults against their honor. What would they do to someone who had taken their cubs? Even if that taking had been a rescue and not a kidnapping, Elena looked down at the cubs gathered around her. At Scout pressed against her side and Vera sitting in her lap. And she made a decision whatever happened next, whatever the Rakari did to her. She would not run, and she would not hide, and she would not fight. She would face them honestly and hope that they could see the truth in her eyes. "Okay, little ones," she said softly. And she closed the book she had been reading. "I think your family is here." The cubs stirred and looked up at her with their big eyes. And some of them whimpered because they could sense the tension in her voice. Vera reached up and touched Elena's face with her small paw. And she made a questioning sound that Elena had learned meant, "Are you okay?" Elena smiled down at her and stroked her silver-streaked fur. "I am fine," she said, even though she was not sure if that was true. "Everything is going to be fine." The communication system crackled to life, and a deep growling voice filled the bridge of the stubborn mule human vessel. "This is Alpha Kalash of the Rakari warship Crimson Fang. You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Any resistance will be met with lethal force." Elena took a deep breath and keyed the microphone. "This is Elena Vasquez of the Stubborn Mule," she said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake. "I am powering down my engines now, and I will not resist. And I have 43 Vakari cubs on board who are waiting to go home." There was a long pause on the other end of the communication, and Elena could almost feel the surprise radiating through the speakers. "You will open your main airlock," said the voice finally. "You will stand back and allow us to board. And you will make no sudden movements, understood?" said Elena. "The airlock is opening now." She stood up slowly, careful not to disturb Vera, who was still in her arms. And she walked toward the main corridor that led to the airlock. The cubs followed her like they always did. A furry parade of little ones who had learned over the past weeks that Elena would keep them. Safe Scout walked beside her with his head held high. And he was trying to be brave, even though Elena could see that he was scared. She reached down and ruffled the fur on his head. "It is okay," she said. "These are your people, and they have come to take you home." She reached the airlock and stood in the center of the corridor with the cubs gathered behind her. And she heard the hiss of pressure equalizing and the clang of metal on metal as the Vakari ship connected with her own. The airlock door opened, and Elena saw death standing on the other side. 20 Vakari warriors poured through the opening, each one massive and muscled and covered in battle scars. And their fangs were bared, and their claws were extended, and their eyes burned with a cold fury that made Elena's knees weak. At the front of them was the largest Vakari she had ever seen. A silver-streaked male with golden eyes and a presence that commanded attention without words. This was Alpha Kalash. She knew without being told. And this was the father who had crossed the galaxy to find his stolen children. He looked at Elena and saw a small human woman, thin and exhausted and clearly terrified, standing between him and his cubs. And then something strange happened. The cubs behind Elena did not run to the warriors, did not cry out in joy at seeing their own kind, did not rush to be reunited with their families. Instead, they pressed closer to Elena, and some of them hid behind her legs. And they watched the warriors with wary eyes. Scout stepped forward and positioned himself in front of Elena. And he bared his teeth at the warriors in a gesture that was clearly protective. Akalesh stopped in his tracks, and his golden eyes widened with something that looked like shock. "Cubs," he said, and his voice had lost all of its hardness. "We have come to take you home. Why do you protect this human?" Scout growled something in his own language, and Kalash's expression changed from shock to disbelief. Elena did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning when Vera climbed out of her arms and stood in front of her. Small and fierce and absolutely determined, the little one with golden eyes and silver-streaked fur, the one Elena had named without knowing her true name, planted herself between Elena and the warriors and spoke in a clear, high voice. Kalish staggered backward like he had been struck, and the warriors behind him exchanged stunned glances. "What did she say?" asked Elena. Her voice barely a whisper. One of the warriors, an older male with scarred face and gentle eyes, stepped forward and answered her. "She said that you are Pack," he translated, and there was wonder in his voice. "She said that you saved them and fed them and kept them warm. And she said that anyone who hurts you will have to go through her first." He paused and looked at Kalish. "That is your daughter," he said. "That is Vera, and she has claimed this human as family." Elena looked down at the little one standing so bravely in front of her, and suddenly she understood why this cub had felt different from the beginning. This was the Alpha's daughter, and she was protecting Elena with everything she had. Kalish stepped forward, slowly, and his warriors parted to let him pass. And he walked until he was standing just a few feet away from Elena and his daughter up close. Elena could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weeks of fear and rage and desperate hope that had carved lines into his face. He looked at Elena for a long moment, and then he looked at the cubs gathered around her, and then he looked at his daughter Vera, he said softly, and his voice cracked on the word. The little one's ears perked up at the sound of her father's voice, and Elena could see the recognition in her golden eyes. But she did not move from her position. She stayed in front of Elena, and she waited. Kalish knelt down so that he was at eye level with his daughter, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "I have been searching for you," he said. "I have crossed the stars to find you, and I was so afraid." Vera's fierce expression softened, and she looked back at Elena with a question in her eyes. Elena nodded and gave her a small smile. "Go to your father," she said. "It is okay." Vera launched herself into Kalish's arms, and he caught her and held her tight. And the mighty Alpha of the Rakari buried his face in his daughter's fur and wept. 3 days had passed since the Rakari fleet had found the stubborn mule, and Elena's ship had been transformed. Rakari engineers had swarmed through every system, replacing worn components and upgrading failing equipment. And the oxygen scrubbers that Elena had struggled to keep running were now working better than they had since the ship was built. Elena stood on the bridge and watched the work happening around her, and she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and discomfort. She was not used to people helping her, not used to people caring about her well-being, and the attention made her feel awkward and expected. Kalish appeared in the doorway, and he had to duck his head to fit through the human-sized opening. "The repairs are nearly complete," he said. "My engineers tell me that your ship will run for another 20 years without trouble." Elena shook her head in wonder. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "This is more than I could ever repay." Kalish made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You saved 43 of our children," he said. "The repairs to your ship are nothing compared to that debt." He walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars, and his expression grew thoughtful. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told her, "about how you just did what anyone would do." He turned to face her. "I do not believe that is true," he said, "but it made me wonder about your people, about humans." Elena tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "The galaxy knows very little about humanity," said Kalish. "Your species is young, and your territory is small, and most of the major powers dismiss you as irrelevant." He paused. "But if what you did is common among your kind, then perhaps the galaxy has been wrong about humans." Elena thought about that for a moment. "I am not sure if it is common," she admitted. "Humans can be cruel and selfish just like any other species, and we have done terrible things to each other throughout our history." She looked out at the stars. "But I think most humans would have helped those children," she said. "I think most humans would have looked at cubs in cages and felt their hearts break." And I think most humans would have tried to do something. Kalash nodded slowly. That is what makes your species interesting, he said. You are weak and fragile by galactic standards, and you have no natural weapons. And your technology is primitive compared to the older races. He smiled. But you have something else, he said. Something that I am not sure has a name in any language I know. What is that? Asked Elena. Compassion without calculation, said Kalash. The ability to see suffering and respond to it without first asking what you will gain. He shook his head. Most species help others when there is profit to be made, or alliances to be formed, or favors to be owed. But you helped our cubs with no thought of reward. And that is extraordinary. Elena felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. I think you give me too much credit, she said. I was scared the whole time, and I did not know what I was doing. And I made 100 mistakes, and yet the cubs survived, said Kalash. And they love you, and they trust you. And that tells me everything I need to know. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Watching the stars wheel past, I have made my decision, said Elena finally. About what comes next. Kalash turned to look at her. Tell me. Kira has no home to return to, said Elena. His parents are dead, and he has claimed me as his mother. And I will not abandon him. She took a deep breath. I want to come with you to Rickery Space, she said. I want to raise my son among his people, where he can learn about his heritage and his culture. Kalash's expression brightened. You are certain? He asked. You will be leaving behind everything you know. Elena smiled. What am I leaving behind? She asked. A broken ship and a lonely life hauling cargo between stations where no one knows my name. She looked toward the cargo hold, where Kira and Vera were playing with the other cubs. For the first time in my life, I have a family, she said. I have people who care about me, and I am not going to give that up. Kalash placed his paw on her shoulder. Then you are welcome among us, he said. Pack friend Elena, mother of Kira, friend of Vera. First human to be claimed by the pack. He grinned, showing his fangs. The elders on the homeworld are going to lose their minds when they meet you. Elena laughed despite herself. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Honestly, I am not sure, admitted Kalash. Nothing like this has ever happened before. And the elders do not handle new things very well. He waved a dismissive paw. But they will accept you, he said. They have no choice, and the law of the cubs is older than any of them. Elena nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. What about the consortium? She asked. The ones who took the cubs in the first place. Kalash's expression turned cold. They will be dealt with, he said. And there was no mercy in his voice. We have already destroyed their operations in 3 systems. And we will not stop until every slaver who participated in the raid is dead. He looked at Elena. Would you like to be part of that hunt? He asked. You have earned the right. Elena thought about the slavers, about the cages she had found on their ship, about the fear in the cubs' eyes when she first rescued them. Yes, she said. And she was surprised by the steel in her own voice. I would like to see them pay for what they did. Kalash smiled, and it was a predator's smile. Good, he said. I think you will fit in well with the pack. That night, Elena sat in the cargo hold with Kira curled up in her lap and Vera pressed against her side. And she watched the other cubs sleeping in their pile of blankets. The Vakari warriors had brought proper beds and proper food and proper clothes for the children. But the cubs still preferred to sleep together the way they had during the weeks on Elena's ship. Elena, said Kira softly, and his comment had improved dramatically over the past few days. Are you really coming home with us? Yes, sweetheart, said Elena. I am coming home with you. Forever, asked Kira. Forever, promised Elena. Vera made a happy sound and snuggled closer. Good, she said. Papa said you are packed now. And pack stays together always. Elena stroked the fur on both their heads and felt tears prickling at her eyes. Always. She agreed she thought about her old life. About the years of loneliness and struggle. About the empty spaces between stars where she had drifted without purpose. All of that was behind her. Now she had found something she had never known she was looking for. And she was never going to let it go. "Get some sleep, little ones," she said softly. "Tomorrow we start the journey to your homeworld." Kira and Vera closed their eyes and relaxed against her. And within moments they were asleep. Elena stayed awake a while longer, watching over them. And she made a silent promise to whatever force had guided her to that slaver ship. She would protect these children with everything she had. And she would make sure they never knew fear again. It was what any mother would do. The howling faded into silence, and Elena found herself surrounded by warriors who looked at her with something she had never expected to see in their eyes: respect. The older warrior with the scarred face stepped forward and bowed his head to her, a gesture that seemed to carry great weight among the Vrikari. "I am Theron," he said. "I have served beside Alpha Kalash for 40 years, and I have seen many things in my life. But I have never seen anything like what you have done." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. "The cubs have told us everything," continued Theron. "They have told us how you found them in cages on the slaver ship, how you carried them one by one to your vessel, how you learned to care for them even though you knew nothing about our kind." He looked at Scout, who was still pressed close to Elena's side. "That one," he said. "His name is actually Kira. And he told us that you were the first person to show him kindness since his parents were killed in the raid." Elena looked down at Scout, at Kira, and she felt her heart break a little more. "I did not know," she said softly. "I did not know he had lost his parents. He did not tell you because he did not want you to be sad," said Theron. "He said that you had enough to worry about without adding his grief to your burden." Elena knelt down and pulled Kira into a tight hug, and the young cub buried his face in her shoulder and made a soft whimpering sound. "I am so sorry," she whispered into his fur. "I am so sorry about your parents." Kira pulled back and looked at her with his dark eyes. And then he spoke in halting common like Vera had done. "You mother now," he said. And his voice was small but certain. "You pack." Elena felt tears streaming down her face, and she could not find words to respond. Kalish watched this exchange with an expression that was impossible to read. And when Elena finally looked up at him, he spoke in a voice that was gentle. "The young one has claimed you as his mother," he said. "This is not something that happens often, and it is not something that can be taken lightly." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means that you are responsible for him," said Kalesh. "It means that you are his family, and he is yours. And the bond between you is sacred." He paused and tilted his head. "It also means that if you accept his claim, he will return with you to human space. Or you will come with us to Vrikari space. But either way, you will not be separated." Elena looked down at Kira, at the hope and fear in his eyes. And she knew that there was only one answer she could give. "Of course I accept," she said. "He is my son." Kira made a sound of pure joy and threw himself into her arms again. And Elena held him close and stroked his fur and promised silently that she would never let anyone hurt him. The warriors around her were making soft sounds of approval. And Elena realized that she had just passed some kind of test. "There is much to discuss," said Kalish. "But first, I must do something that I should have done the moment I understood the truth." He looked at Elena with his golden eyes. And then he did something that made every warrior in the corridor gasp. Alpha Kalish, leader of the Crimson Fang Pack, terror of 12 star systems, undefeated in 40 years of warfare, dropped to one knee before Elena. "I kneel to you," he said. And his voice rang through the corridor. "Not because you are stronger than me, And not because you command armies or fleets, but because you did something that no one else in this galaxy would have done. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. You saved our children, he said. You asked for nothing and expected nothing, and you gave everything you had. And I do not have words sufficient to express my gratitude. One by one, the warriors behind him dropped to their knees as well, until Elena was standing alone in a sea of kneeling. Rekarish did not know what to do or what to say, and she felt overwhelmed by the weight of their gesture. Please, she said, her voice shaking, please stand up. I did not do anything special. I just did what anyone would do. Kalash smiled and shook his head. That is where you are wrong, he said. We have traveled across this galaxy for centuries, and we have met hundreds of species, and not one of them has ever done what you did. He rose to his feet, and his warriors followed. They see our cubs, and they see profit, he said. They see exotic pets or valuable slaves or troublesome burdens, and they calculate the cost of helping against the benefit of walking away, and they always choose themselves. He stepped closer to Elena and placed both paws on her shoulders. But you saw children in need, he said, and you did not calculate anything, and you did not weigh costs against benefits, and you simply acted. He shook his head in wonder. That is not common, he said. That is rare beyond measure, and that is why my warriors kneel. Elena did not know what to say, so she said the only thing she could think of. I just wanted them to be safe. Kalash laughed, and it was a warm sound that seemed to fill the corridor. Yes, he said. You keep saying that, and you do not seem to understand how extraordinary it is. He released her shoulders and turned to address his warriors. We will escort this vessel back to our fleet, he announced. We will repair her ship and restore her supplies, and we will ensure that she reaches her destination safely. He looked back at Elena. Unless you would prefer to come with us to Vakari space. Elena looked at Kira, who was still holding her hand, and at Vera, who had not moved from her side. What would happen to them if I stayed in human space? She asked. Kalash considered the question. Kira has claimed you as his mother, he said. He would go wherever you go, and the pack would not stop him. He looked at his daughter. Vera has her own home and family, he said. But something tells me that she would want to see you often. No matter where you lived, Vera nodded vigorously. Visit always, she said in her broken common. Elena pack forever. Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion she could not name. She had spent her whole life alone, hauling cargo through the empty spaces between stars, never staying in one place long enough to make friends or build connections. And now, because she had stopped to help some children in cages, she had a son and a family and a people who knelt to her, and gratitude. It was almost too much to process. I need to think about it, she said, finally. This is all happening very fast. Kalash nodded in understanding. Of course, he said. Take all the time you need, and know that whatever you decide, you will always have a home among the pack. He turned and began issuing orders to his warriors, and the corridor filled with activity as Vakari moved to assist with repairs and preparations. Elena stood in the middle of it all, with Kira on one side and Vera on the other, and she watched the fierce warriors who had come for vengeance work together to help her. She had never felt less alone in her entire life. 5 years had passed since Elena Vasquez first found the cubs in cages on that dying slaver ship, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Elena stood on the balcony of her home on Vrikar Prime and watched the twin suns set behind the mountains, and the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple and gold behind her. She could hear the sounds of her family preparing for dinner, the clatter of dishes and the laughter of children, and the deep rumbling voices of Vakari adults. She smiled and closed her eyes and let the sounds wash over her. Mother, called Kira from inside the house. Dinner is ready. Coming, She called back Kira was 12 years old now, tall and strong and growing more confident every day. And he had become one of the best students in his age group at the pack school. He still called her mother, still looked to her for guidance and comfort, still curled up beside her on cold nights when he missed his birth parents. He was her son in every way that mattered. And she loved him more than she had ever loved anything. Elena walked inside and took her place at the table. And she looked around at the faces gathered there. Kira sat to her right, and Vera sat to her left, and across from them sat Kalish and his new mate, a fierce warrior named Sasha, who had become Elena's closest friend. The table was full of food, a mixture of Ricari dishes and human recipes that Elena had taught the pack cooks to prepare. And the conversation flowed easily between languages as everyone talked about their day. This was her life now, and it was better than anything she could have imagined. "Elena," said Kalish, and his voice was serious. "I have news." Elena looked up from her plate. "What is it?" "We found the last of the consortium slavers," said Kalish. "The ones who escaped when we destroyed their base in the Kelver system." Elena felt her jaw tighten. Over the past 5 years, the pack had systematically hunted down every single person involved in the raid on the nursery compound, and they had shown no mercy. Elena had been part of many of those hunts, had watched justice be delivered to those who would steal children from their beds, and she felt no guilt about any of it. "Where are they?" she asked. "They fled to human space," said Kalish. "They thought they would be safe there, that we would not follow." He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator closing in on its prey. "They were wrong. The human government has offered to help us apprehend them," continued Kalish. "They were quite eager to cooperate once they learned what the consortium had done." Elena nodded. Relations between the Ricari and humanity had changed dramatically in the past 5 years, largely because of what Elena had done. When word spread through the galaxy about the human cargo hauler who had saved 43 Ricari cubs and been claimed as pack, other species took notice. The Ricari were feared throughout known space, and any species that earned their respect was a species worth knowing. Human diplomats had arrived on Vreker Prime within months of Elena's adoption into the pack, and they had negotiated trade agreements and defense pacts and cultural exchanges. Elena had become something of an ambassador herself, helping both sides understand each other, translating not just languages but perspectives. "Will you come with us on this final hunt?" asked Kalish. "The pack would be honored to have you there when we close this chapter." Elena looked at Kira, who nodded encouragingly. "Go, mother," he said. "I will be fine here with Aunt Sasha and Uncle Theron." Elena smiled at her son. He had come so far from the frightened cub who had first approached her on the slaver ship, and she was so proud of the young man he was becoming. "Yes," she said to Kalish, "I will come." The hunt took 3 weeks, and when it was done, the last of the consortium slavers had been brought to justice, and the pack could finally rest. Elena stood on the bridge of the Crimson Fang as they made the jump back to Vreker Prime, and she felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. It was finished. The children were safe, and the slavers were gone, and the pack had won. Kalish came to stand beside her at the viewport. "You know," he said, "when I first saw you on that broken cargo ship, I thought I was looking at the weakest creature I had ever seen." Elena laughed. "To be fair, I was pretty weak," she said. "I could barely stand up. I was so tired and hungry. But you stood between me and my cubs," said Kalish. "You did not run, you did not beg, you did not make excuses, and you simply stood there and waited to see what would happen." He shook his head in wonder. "I have fought enemies who were bigger than me, stronger than me, more dangerous than me, but I have never met anyone braver than you." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I thought you were going to kill me." "I know," said Kalish, "and you stood your ground anyway. And that is what bravery really means." He placed his paw on her shoulder. "The galaxy is beginning to learn what we learned that day," he said. "They are beginning to understand that humans are not weak, and they are not insignificant. And they are not to be underestimated." He smiled. "They are learning that humans will starve themselves to feed children who are not their own. And they will stand against armies for people they have never met. And they will do what is right even when it costs them everything." He looked out at the stars. "That is a terrifying thing for the galaxy to learn," he said. "And I think the future is going to be very interesting." Elena smiled and leaned against the massive warrior who had become her friend and brother in Alpha. "Yes," she said. "I think it will be." 6 months later, Elena received word that the Galactic Council had voted to grant humanity full membership, a status that usually took centuries to achieve. The council representatives had cited many reasons for their decision, including human technological progress and diplomatic skill. But everyone knew the real reason: a single human woman had shown the galaxy what humanity was capable of. And the galaxy had decided that it wanted those people as allies rather than enemies. Elena did not attend the ceremony because she was busy on Riga Prime, helping to plan her son's coming-of-age celebration. But she watched the broadcast with her family gathered around her, and she smiled when the human ambassador mentioned her name. "Let this be a lesson to all species," said the ambassador. "A single act of compassion can change the course of history, and a single person can make a difference that echoes through eternity." Kira squeezed his mother's hand. "She is talking about you," he said proudly. Elena squeezed back. "She is talking about what anyone would do," she said, but deep down, she knew that was not quite true. She had done something extraordinary, something that had changed her life and the lives of everyone around her. And she had done it without thinking, without calculating, without asking what she would gain. She had done it because it was right, and that, in the end, was the most human thing of all. The story of Elena Vasquez spread throughout the galaxy, and it became a legend told around fires and in schools and in the halls of power. It was the story of a weak and fragile human who saved the children of warriors, who earned the respect of the fiercest pack in known space, who showed the galaxy that courage is not about strength and kindness is not about profit. It was a story that would be remembered for centuries, long after Elena herself was gone. But Elena did not care about legends. She cared about her son and her pack and the family she had found in the most unlikely of places. She had come looking for salvage, and she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found home.